The velvet tray held 11 rings, and Renata Blackwood had polished each one twice that morning before the store opened, because Kestrel and Vane on the Ginza Strip did not tolerate a single smudge on the glass or a single fingerprint on the platinum, not when their clientele paid the kind of money that expected perfection as a baseline rather than an achievement. She was 27 years old, 3 years into a job that had taught her to read a customer's intentions before they said a word, to know within 30 seconds whether someone browsing the display cases intended to buy or simply intended to be seen browsing, and she was reaching for the cleaning cloth again when the door chime sounded and the temperature of the room changed before she even looked up. She knew the sound of his footsteps before she registered his face, which unsettled her more than it should have, given that 4 years had passed since she'd last heard them crossing a floor toward her. Kenji Watanabe stood in the doorway of the shop in a charcoal suit tailored close enough to show he had not softened in the year since Tokyo, his hair combed back the way he'd always worn it when business required him to look untouchable. A thin scar traced the edge of his jaw, new since she'd known him, pale against skin that still carried the faint scent of cedar and something darker underneath it, smoke maybe, or the particular cold that clung to men who dealt in territory instead of trade. Renata's hands went still on the tray of rings. She had spent 4 years building a life in Tokyo that did not include Kenji Watanabe, had crossed an ocean and rebuilt herself twice over specifically, so she would never again have to stand in a room and feel her pulse answer to the sight of him, and here he was, filling the doorway of Kestrel and Vane like the building had been waiting for him the entire time. "Renata," he said, and the way he said her name, low and deliberate, landed differently than it had any right to after 4 years of silence. "Mr. Watanabe," she said, reaching for the professional distance that had gotten her through worse mornings than this one. "Welcome to Kestrel and Vane. Is there something specific I can help you find today?" Something flickered behind his eyes at the formality, gone as fast as it appeared. "A ring," he said. "For my fiancé." The word landed in Renata's chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in ways she refused to let show on her face. She had trained for 4 years not to let anything show on her face, not grief, not anger, not the particular ache of hearing a man she'd once loved say the word fiancé about someone who was not her. "Of course," she said, and turned the tray toward him with hands that did not shake, though the effort of keeping them steady cost her more than any customer in that shop had ever asked of her. "What is she like? It helps to know something about her, so I can point you toward pieces that suit her rather than pieces that simply cost the most." "Careful," Kenji said. "Precise. She notices things other people miss." His gaze had not left Renata's face since he crossed the threshold, and there was something in the way he was studying her, cataloging, the way he'd always looked at problems he intended to solve rather than accept. "She reminds me of someone I used to know." Renata's jaw tightened. She would not ask who. She refused to give him the satisfaction of watching the question cost her something in front of him. "This one," she said instead, lifting a platinum band set with a single emerald cut stone from the tray, her voice as even as she could make it. "Clean lines. Understated. It doesn't try to impress anyone, which usually means it impresses everyone." Kenji did not look at the ring. He kept looking at her. "You still do that thing with your voice when you're forcing yourself to sound calm," he said, quiet enough that the other clerk across the shop would not hear it. "I forgot how well I used to know the sound of you lying." "I'm not lying," Renata said. "I'm working." "You're doing both," Kenji said, "and you're doing them at the same time, which was always your particular skill." He set the emerald ring back on the tray, without looking at it once. "I did not expect to find you here. Tokyo is a large city, and I was told this shop's finest clerk had come from London 3 years ago. I did not put the pieces together until I was standing in the doorway looking at you." "I didn't know you were in the market for a fiancé," Renata said, and hated the edge that crept into her voice despite every effort to keep it out. "Last I remember, you told me marriage was not a risk you could afford to take, not in your line of work. Too much exposure. Too much leverage handed to your enemies." Something crossed his face then, brief and unguarded, gone before she could fully name it. "Circumstances changed," he said. "The organization required it. An alliance with another family, sealed the old way, through marriage rather than through paper. His voice had dropped lower now, something rawer underneath the careful control. It was not a choice I made for the reasons you're imagining. I'm not imagining anything, Renata said. It's not my business what reasons you have for marrying someone, Mr. Watanabe. I'm only here to help you choose a ring. The formality of the title sat between them like a wall she'd built specifically to keep him on the other side of it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The shop's other customers and the low hum of Ginza traffic outside, the only sound filling the space where 4 years of unfinished history now stood between them, close enough to touch, too dangerous to acknowledge. Then help me, Kenji said finally, his voice steady again, though something underneath it had not fully recovered its usual control. Show me what you'd choose, if you were choosing for yourself. The question landed with more weight than he likely intended, and Renata felt the careful architecture of her composure strain under it, because the honest answer was that she had once imagined exactly this moment, for years ago, in a different city, believing then that the ring in question might one day be meant for her. I don't choose rings for myself, she said. I sell them to other people. That's the job. But even as she said it, she was already reaching for a different tray, one kept in the back cabinet reserved for the shop's rarest pieces, and something in the deliberate way her hand moved told her, before she'd fully admitted it to herself, that this conversation was far from finished. The back cabinet held pieces most customers never saw, stones the shop kept for clients whose names carried enough weight to warrant discretion, and Renata set the second tray down between them with hands that had finally steadied. She could feel Kenji watching her rather than the rings, and she made herself focus on the platinum and the stones instead of the particular heat of his attention, because focusing on anything else would unravel for years of careful distance faster than she could afford. These are the pieces we don't display, she said. Reserved for clients the owner trusts to handle discretion properly. And you decided I qualified, Kenji said. I decided you were already standing in my shop asking questions I couldn't answer with a display case, Renata said. That's not the same as trust. He almost smiled at that, the ghost of an expression she remembered from a version of him that had existed before Tokyo swallowed whatever softness he'd once allowed himself around her. Before she could examine that thought further, the shop's front door opened hard enough to rattle the glass, and 3 men in dark coats stepped through with a particular economy of movement that told Renata, even before she'd fully processed the danger, that this was not a robbery in the ordinary sense. Watanabe, the lead man said, his voice carrying across the shop floor with practiced calm. The Hoshino family sends regards. And a message about territory you were told to vacate by the end of the month. Kenji's posture shifted instantly, the ease of a moment ago replaced by something coiled and absolute, and Renata felt the air in the shop change temperature the way it only did when violence had walked through a door and had not yet decided how far it intended to go. This is not the place, Kenji said, voice low, controlled, though Renata could hear the warning underneath it plainly enough. There are civilians here. Territory disputes don't wait for convenient locations, the man said, and his hand moved toward his coat. Renata did not think. She acted, the way she'd learned to act during 3 years of managing a shop that occasionally attracted the kind of client who brought danger with them into a room full of glass and irreplaceable stones. She swept the tray of rings off the counter and onto the floor between the men and Kenji, the crash and scatter of platinum and stone drawing every eye in the room for the half-second Kenji needed, and in that half-second he moved, closing the distance to the lead man with a speed that startled her, even though she'd once known exactly what he was capable of. The fight that followed lasted less than a minute, brutal and economical, Kenji disarming the lead man with a motion so precise it barely looked like effort, while the other 2 hesitated at the edge of the confrontation, clearly unprepared for how fast the balance had shifted against them. Renata used the chaos to pull the shop's other clerk behind the security counter, out of the line of any further violence, her pulse hammering but her hands steady in a way that surprised even her. When it ended, the 3 men retreating through the shattered doorway with clear instructions ringing behind them about what would happen if they returned, Kenji turned back to find Renata standing exactly where she'd thrown the tray, glass and platinum scattered around her feet, her chest rising and falling fast but her expression composed. You could have been hurt, he said, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides, his hands coming up to check her for injury with a focus that had nothing professional left in it. "So could you," Renata said. "I didn't throw the tray to protect myself. I threw it to buy you the half-second you needed." Something in his face changed then, the careful control cracking in a way she had not seen since the last night they'd spent together in Tokyo, for years and a lifetime ago. "Why," he said, quieter now. "Because some habits don't die just because the person carrying them tried very hard to kill them," Renata said, and the honesty of it surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. He insisted on driving her home himself once the shop's owner arrived and the police had taken their statements, and Renata did not have the strength left that evening to argue against it, the adrenaline of the fight finally draining out of her in the back seat of his car, leaving something rawer and more exposed in its place. Kenji drove in silence for several minutes, the city lights sliding past the window, before he spoke again. "I never told you the real reason I ended things 4 years ago," he said, eyes fixed on the road, his hands steady on the wheel in a way that told her the steadiness cost him something. "I told you it was about the danger my world would bring into your life. That was true, but it was not the whole truth." "Then tell me the rest," Renata said, "since apparently we're having this conversation whether I asked for it or not." "There was a woman before you," Kenji said. "Not romantically. My cousin Hannah. She worked alongside me in the early years, before I inherited full control of the organization. A rival family targeted her specifically because she was close to me, believing it would force my hand in a territory dispute I refused to concede." His jaw tightened, the old grief still sharp enough to change the shape of his voice. "I got to her 4 minutes too late. I've spent every year since making certain nobody I care for stands close enough to become leverage again. That is the real reason I let you go. Not because the danger frightened me, because I had already watched it cost someone everything, and I could not survive watching it happen twice." Renata sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling somewhere she had not expected to feel anything for him again, an old ache stirring back to life in a place she had believed thoroughly closed off. "You never told me any of that," she said. "You just left. A note and a wired account transfer, and nothing else, like I was a business arrangement you were closing out rather than a person you'd spent 2 years building a life alongside." "I know," Kenji said. "It was cowardice dressed up as protection. I understand that now better than I did then." The car pulled up outside her apartment building, and neither of them moved to end the moment, the silence between them carrying more honesty than 4 years of careful distance had allowed either of them to admit. "Why are you telling me this now?" Renata asked. "You're engaged, Kenji. Whatever this is, it doesn't change that." "I'm telling you," he said, "because tonight reminded me that I have spent 4 years protecting myself from a danger that already happened, and I do not know how to keep doing that now that you're standing in front of me again." His eyes met hers, something unguarded in them that she had rarely seen even in the years they'd spent together. "The alliance my organization requires does not require me to feel nothing. I have simply been very good at pretending otherwise." Renata's hand was on the door handle, every rational part of her insisting she get out of the car and close the door on this conversation before it went somewhere neither of them could walk back from. But she did not move yet, and in the charged quiet of the car, the city noise muffled beyond the windows, she understood that whatever 4 years apart had been meant to accomplish, it had not managed to make either of them into people who could sit this close to each other and feel nothing at all. What she did not know yet was that the men who had attacked the shop that evening were not acting alone, and that the message they delivered about territory was only the opening move in a conflict that was about to make her considerably more than an accidental witness to Kenji Watanabe's world. 2 days later, a woman entered Kestrel and Vane wearing a coat too heavy for the mild afternoon and asked specifically for Renata by name, and something in the careful, deliberate way she moved through the shop told Renata immediately that this was not a customer interested in rings. "You've been seen with Kenji Watanabe," the woman said, once she'd drawn Renata toward the back of the shop, away from the other clerks. "The Hoshino family does not appreciate loose ends, and right now you are precisely that. A woman with a history with him, resurfacing at a convenient moment. Some of my employer's people believe you might be feeding him information. Others believe he's grown careless because of you. Either way, you have become a problem worth solving. Renata's pulse spiked, but she kept her expression flat, the same composure that had carried her through the fight in the shop 2 days earlier. I sell jewelry, she said. I haven't spoken to Kenji Watanabe in 4 years until 2 days ago. That's not the impression you gave, standing close enough in his car outside your apartment for half the street to notice, the woman said, and Renata's stomach dropped, understanding now that she had been watched, followed, catalogued, in the 2 days since the attack at the shop. Consider this a courtesy. Distance yourself from him, publicly and immediately, or the next visit to this shop will not be a conversation. The woman left without waiting for a response, and Renata stood alone in the back of the shop for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the counter to keep them from shaking, before she reached for her phone and called the only number in Tokyo that felt, in that moment, like it might actually keep her safe. Kenji arrived within 20 minutes, and the fury in his face when she described the encounter was unlike anything she had seen from him even during the fight 2 days before, controlled and absolute in a way that made her understand, more clearly than any story he could have told her, exactly how dangerous a man he had become in the years since Tokyo had last belonged to both of them. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent, he said, pacing the length of the back room. The moment they believe you matter to me, you become a target regardless of whether that belief is accurate. It's accurate, Renata said, before she could stop herself, the words arriving faster than her caution usually allowed. Whatever this is between us, Kenji, it's not nothing, and pretending otherwise isn't going to make either of us safer. It's just going to make me easier to use against you, because I won't see it coming. He stopped pacing, looking at her with an expression that had stripped away the last of the careful distance either of them had been maintaining since he'd walked into the shop 2 days earlier. What do you want me to do? He said. Walk away again. Pretend this conversation never happened. I want you to stop deciding things for me, Renata said. You did that 4 years ago. You decided the danger was too much for me to choose for myself, and you left without asking what I wanted. I'm not the same woman who let you make that choice unchallenged. Whatever risk comes with standing near you, I want the chance to weigh it myself. Something in Kenji's expression cracked then, the last of his careful control giving way to something raw and unguarded. I told myself staying away from you was survival, he said, quiet, honest in a way that cost him visibly. I was lying to myself. It was the opposite of survival. It was 4 years of watching myself go through the motions of a life I did not actually want. The confession sat between them, heavier and more dangerous than any declaration of love could have been, because it named something neither of them could undo now that it had been spoken aloud. Renata crossed the distance between them, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him, close enough that the careful professional distance of the past 2 days finally, fully collapsed. Then stop lying to both of us, she said. He kissed her then, unhurried despite the danger sitting just outside the door of the shop, the kind of kiss that had clearly been waiting 4 years for permission neither of them had believed they would ever grant again. Renata felt every careful wall she'd rebuilt since Tokyo come down at once, not from weakness, but because for the first time since the woman in the heavy coat had walked into the shop, she understood exactly what she was choosing and chose it anyway. When they finally broke apart, Kenji rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteady in a way she had never once seen from him during their years together in Tokyo. This does not end well for you if the Hoshino family decides you're a target worth pursuing, he said. I need you to understand that before we go any further. I understood that the moment the woman walked into the shop, Renata said.
He chose anyway.
The choice, once made, demanded something in return, and 3 days later Renata found herself standing in a warehouse on the edge of Tokyo's harbor district that had nothing to do with jewelry and everything to do with the war. Kenji was now fighting to keep both their names off the Hoshino family's list of unresolved business. She had come because Kenji's second-in-command, a woman named Yuki Sato, had reached out privately, explaining that the Hoshino family's local financial records, if exposed to the right people, could dismantle their claim to the disputed territory entirely, and that exposing them required someone with an outsider's access, someone whose face the Hoshino family's contacts would not immediately recognize. Renata had spent 3 years building relationships with wealthy clients across Tokyo through Kestrel and Vane, relationships that included a banking contact who occasionally handled discretion for clients whose business required it. Using that relationship to access records that were never meant to be exposed was, by any measure, a line she could not uncross once she'd crossed it, a choice that made her complicit in a war she had entered only days earlier as a bystander. She made the call, anyway. The information Renata obtained that night confirmed what Kenji's organization had suspected but could not prove, that the Hoshino family's claim to the disputed territory rested on a set of falsified property transfers dating back years, records that, once exposed to the territorial registrar's office, would collapse their legal standing entirely and remove the justification for continued aggression. It was not a clean victory. It required Renata to become someone she had not been 3 days earlier, a woman willing to bend rules and risk consequences for a man whose world had already cost her once. When she delivered the information to Kenji that night, his expression carried something that looked almost like fear, an emotion she had rarely seen from him even in the worst of their encounters. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "That kind of exposure, if it's traced back to you, carries real consequences. Legal ones. Personal ones." "I know exactly what it cost," Renata said. "I did it anyway because I am done being someone who only survives your world from a safe distance. If I'm choosing you, I'm choosing all of it." That was when the call came through on Kenji's phone, his expression shifting instantly from something warm to something cold and absolute, and Renata understood before he said a word that the Hoshino family had already discovered what she'd done. "They're at the shop," Kenji said, already moving toward the door, his voice stripped of every trace of warmth from moments before. "Yuki says 2 men entered 10 minutes ago asking for you by name. The owner tried to stall them. I don't know how long that buys us." The drive across the city felt endless despite taking less than 15 minutes, Kenji's hands white-knuckled on the wheel, and when they arrived at Kestrel and Vane the front window had been shattered outright, glass scattered across the sidewalk, and the shop's owner stood outside with a split lip and a story that made Renata's blood run cold. The 2 men had asked for her specifically, and when told she was not present, they'd made it clear the next visit would not end with a broken window. "They know I helped expose the property records," Renata said, standing amid the wreckage of a shop she had spent 3 years building a life around. "They're not interested in territory anymore. This is retaliation." "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Kenji said, and for the first time since she'd known him, Renata heard something that sounded unmistakably like panic underneath his usual control. "I cannot lose you the way I lost Hannah. I will not survive watching that happen twice." "Then don't watch it happen," Renata said. "Let me help end it instead of standing behind you while you fight it alone." The confrontation came that same night, the Hoshino family's remaining leadership gathering at a private meeting Kenji's organization had arranged under the pretense of a final negotiation over the disputed territory, and Renata insisted on being present despite Kenji's objections, because she understood, with a clarity she had not possessed for years earlier, that hiding from the danger would not make her safer, only more vulnerable to it finding her unprepared. The meeting took place in a private room above a restaurant in Shinjuku. The Hoshino family's remaining leader, a sharp-featured man named Ryo Fujimori, seated across a low table from Kenji, with 2 of his lieutenants flanking him. Renata stood near the doorway, close enough to see everything, far enough to stay out of the immediate line of any violence, exactly as Kenji had insisted before they arrived. "Your organization exposed records that were never meant to see daylight," Fujimori said, his voice carrying the same practiced calm the man in the jewelry shop had used days earlier. "That is not a business dispute. That is an act of war. Your family falsified property transfers to claim territory that was never legally yours," Kenji said, his voice flat and absolute. "The exposure of those records was not an act of war. It was the correction of one you started years ago." Fujimori's composure thinned, and his gaze shifted toward Renata for the first time since she'd entered the room, something calculating moving behind his eyes. "The woman accessed those records," he said. "A civilian with no standing in this conflict, reaching into business that was never hers. That makes her fair leverage, regardless of what she means to you personally." That was the moment one of Fujimori's lieutenants moved, fast and sudden, a knife appearing from beneath his jacket as he lunged not toward Kenji, but toward Renata standing near the doorway, and Renata understood, in the half-second before impact, that the entire meeting had been staged specifically to create this opening. She did not freeze. She threw herself sideways into the low table, sending it and everything on it crashing into the lieutenant's path, buying herself the half-second needed to close her hand around a heavy ceramic vase from the room's low shelf and drive it hard into the man's temple as he stumbled through the wreckage of the table. He went down, and Kenji was already moving, disarming Fujimori's second lieutenant with brutal, economical precision while Fujimori himself scrambled back from the table, his composure shattered entirely. "Enough," Kenji said, standing over the fallen men with a stillness that carried more menace than any shout could have. "Your family's claim to the territory is finished. The records are already in the hands of the registrar's office. Continue this conflict, and I promise you the next conversation will not include a table for you to hide behind." Fujimori did not argue further. His lieutenants subdued and disarmed, and within the hour word had already begun moving through the organization's channels that the Hoshino family's claim to the disputed territory had collapsed entirely, the falsified records now sitting with the territorial registrar's office exactly as Kenji had promised. The war that had reshaped Renata's life in the span of a single week ended not with a wedding or a declaration, but with the quiet, absolute certainty of two organizations recalculating the cost of continued conflict and choosing to stand down. Renata sat afterward in the back of Kenji's car, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the adrenaline had drained fully out of her, the ceramic vase still gripped tight in one fist, as though she had not fully registered that the danger had passed. Kenji reached over and gently pried her fingers loose from it, setting it aside, his hand closing around hers instead. "You could have died tonight," he said, quiet, the words costing him visibly.
"So could you," Renata said.
"Every night since I walked back into your life, apparently. Seems that's simply the shape of loving you now." Something in his expression shifted at the word, unguarded in a way she had rarely witnessed even in their years together before Tokyo first separated them. "I have spent 4 years telling myself I let you go to protect you," he said. "Tonight I watched you save my life with a vase from a restaurant table, and I understood, finally, that protecting you was never something I could do by keeping you at a distance. You were never going to be safe from my world simply because I removed myself from your life. You were only going to be unprotected. Then stop trying to protect me by disappearing," Renata said. "Protect me by staying close enough to actually do it." There was a cost to what the night had required of them both, and it arrived 3 days later in the form of a visit from Yuki Sato, who informed Kenji quietly that the alliance his organization had arranged through marriage was no longer necessary now that the Hoshino conflict had been resolved on the organization's terms. The political pressure that had once demanded the arrangement dissolved along with the territorial dispute that created it. Kenji delivered the news to Renata standing in the ruins of Kestrel and Vane's shattered front window, the shop's repairs already underway around them, and something in his expression when he told her carried the particular relief of a man setting down a weight he had carried without ever quite naming its full cost. "I'm not engaged," he said. "I have not been, as of this morning. The alliance served its purpose in name only, and now that purpose no longer exists." Renata studied him for a long moment amid the sound of workers repairing the glass around them, the same shop where this entire reckoning had begun less than 2 weeks earlier. "That's convenient timing," she said, though there was no accusation in it, only the careful testing of ground she had learned, slowly, to trust again. "It is not convenient," Kenji said. "It is the truth, finally allowed to exist without a war standing in front of it." He reached into his jacket and produced the emerald ring she had shown him that first afternoon, the one she described as understated in a way that impressed everyone precisely because it did not try to. "I bought this the day after the shop reopened. Not for the woman the alliance required. For the one who threw a tray of rings across a room to save my life before either of us had said a single honest word to the other." Renata looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, for years of careful distance and one impossible week of danger folding down into a single, quiet certainty that had nothing left to prove and nothing left to hide from. She did not say yes immediately. She simply reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had steadied hers through every version of danger the past 2 weeks had thrown at them both, and let the silence between them answer plainly enough for either of them to understand exactly what she had chosen. Outside the shop, Tokyo moved on around them the way it always did, indifferent to the private reckonings of two people who had finally stopped protecting each other by staying apart, the city's noise and motion carrying on exactly as it had every day of the 4 years they'd spent apart and every day before that when they'd first found each other. Renata understood, standing there in the last of the afternoon light, that some choices did not need declarations to be real. They only needed two people willing to stand in the wreckage together and decide, plainly, that they would rather face whatever came next than face it alone. If this story kept you hooked until the very end, you already know what to do. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, hit that like button, and subscribe so you never miss the next story waiting for you.